Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'll just get my PowerPoint up and make sure you can all see it. Now that should be coming up from the beginning. Right, can you all see can someone say yes verbally?
Yep.
Yep, thank you. Brilliant.
Yeah, full page.
Excellent, thank you. Always got to check, because I did actually start a talk and I was on about slide 3 before someone said that they couldn't see it. So I thought it's a good idea to double check. I'm a professional researcher. I live in Norwich and I do family history research, house history, local history research. A lot of the research I do is in East Anglia, but although with house histories, I tend to much wider scope. And I was invited to give this talk, which is based around a book of the same name, and there's the picture of the title on the front, called I Therefore Post Him as a Coward, which is a quote from a document I came across when I was researching a house history some years ago. And it's about a scandal in Norfolk. It revealed a scandal. And the phrase, I therefore post him as cowards, is in the context of a declaration made by the Lord of the Manor to the curate of a little village called Burnham Westgate, sometimes known as Burnham Market, in North Norfolk. I don't know if any of you know North Norfolk, but it's sometimes nicknamed these days Chelsea on Sea, although it's actually not by the sea, although one of the other Burnhams is. There's 7 parishes called Burnham in that area. It's very popular, as you might guess, with people who have second homes. And I've researched 3 or 4 houses in that parish, and this set of documents are what are called broadsheets, a type of sort of, they're often something that are printed, these were handwritten, but sort of the social media of the time. These were things that people issued when they wanted to perhaps make a notice or a political statement or disparage a business rival or spread rumours and so on, and the sorts of things that have been very popular since the beginning, particularly since the emergence of the printing press. And they were a way of spreading news and important notices. And traditionally, a broadsheet might be pinned up in the church porch or read out in the marketplace or in the local inn by someone that could read. And these broadsheets were a series of letters that were copied by the Lord of the Manor, Sir Roger Martin. And they were in response to an incident inside the church in July 1836. And I was very intrigued by this incident because the phrase, I therefore post him as a coward, which this is part of the quote, and here's an example here of the section of one of the broadsheets with R. Martin's signature at the bottom. Mr. H. Bligh, who was Henry Etheridge Bligh, who was the curate who took a church service that week in 1836. Roger Martin issued this statement saying that Mr. H. Bligh of Sussex Farm was rude and impertinent to me after church service on Sunday last. He refuses to make an adequate apology or to adjust the matter in the way which is customary between gentlemen. I therefore post him as a coward. And this is a coded phrase which meant I challenge this person to a duel. Dueling was illegal. It had been since medieval times, but it did go on, obviously. And this was a very common phrase. You're calling someone out, usually to meet you at dawn with pistols or swords as appropriate. So he was saying, if Mr. Henry Bligh does not apologise for his actions in the church last Sunday. I want him to meet me and fight a duel. And this is absolutely astonishing when you think about it. We've got the Lord of the Manor and a curate, a clergyman. And I was absolutely astonished. So I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting in a moment and read an extract at the beginning of my book, which sets the scene as to what happened and why Mr. Henry Bligh might have caused such offence to one of the biggest landowners in the area, and somebody that had the living of the parish, that actually had the power to help appoint clergy. And it drew in his boss, the local rector, William Gilpin, who was a renowned theologian. And I like most family historians or historians, I'm always asking the question why. And this is what led me to investigate and write a book about it, to look at why this might have occurred. So I'm just going to start by reading you a small extract. And when I began to look at it, I realised that the conflict had its roots in other events, other secrets, other scandals. And although this is about something that happened in North Norfolk, it sheds a light on society at the time. It reveals attitudes towards social class. It reveals attitudes towards illegitimacy, the power of the church, the power of local landowners, and perhaps to a large extent, a certain amount of hypocrisy. And as such, we can look at events such as this, wherever they are in the UK, to have a glimpse into the lives and attitudes and social mores of the Georgian period. I think somebody's waiting to come in. So shall I?
Let them in.
Yep. Okay. Brilliant. So I'm just going to start by setting the scene. And this is a very prosperous parish. So at just before 11 o'clock on the morning of Sunday, 4th July, 1836, Sir Roger Martin set out with his close companion and housekeeper, Mary Ann Clark. Together they made their way to St. Mary's Church from their home at Burnham Westgate Hall on the other side of the churchyard wall. Their route took them down the long driveway, through the double gates next to the pit arms, then onto the edge of the marketplace. From here, it was just a few steps to the right to reach the corner of the main road that leads to Docking. Facing the rectory, the house where Sir Roger spent his childhood, they turned sharply to the right again to move alongside the long, low, flint-studded wall encircling the main portion of the churchyard. As the couple made their way along the narrow path towards the church's medieval wooden doorway, it is tempting to imagine that they were observed by those stood chatting to friends and neighbours outside. Entering the church, they could see the grand memorials to Sir Roger's parents and maternal grandparents laid into the floor on the left next to the porch. As they continued up the central aisle towards the front of the church, Sir Roger Martin and Mary Ann Clark passed the poorest villagers who always sat or stood at the back. The small farmers, schoolmistresses, butchers, shopkeepers, publicans, and other respectable tradesmen and women occupied the seats in the middle of the church. They may have just had enough time to gawp in enjoyment at the spectacle or to avert their eyes in embarrassment as Sir Roger and Mary Ann drew adjacent. Even in spiritual matters, people knew their place in the early 19th century. Their place in church reflected their social standing, a physical embodiment of a class-based hierarchy still seen by most people as ordained by God. Perhaps there was a pause for a few seconds when the couple reached the front row. Then, in what Henry Martin claimed was a gross breach of decorum, Sir Roger Martin settled Mary Ann Clark into the Martin family pew directly in front of the altar. The curate about to lead the Sunday morning service was outraged at her being publicly introduced into society in such a manner. For this woman of a very questionable character for respectability had just been exalted to a place of honour that should only be occupied by a wife. So what happened next was, at the end of the service, Henry Bligh stood in the pulpit and told off Roger Martin. As people were leaving the church, so Roger Martin described how he sat in the pew. Mary Ann Clark preceded him out of the church, but there were still many people in the church and on their way out. And Henry Bligh stood up in the pulpit and told him off. He told off the Lord of the Manor for breaching decorum and doing something that was irresponsible. He believed that this place in which this lady had been sat was not appropriate at all. So the question, of course, was why? And the result of this was that Roger Martin sent a letter to Henry Bligh telling him, asking for an apology. Henry Bligh admitted perhaps he should not have done so publicly, but he refused to retract his criticism. He felt that Roger Martin had done something very wrong, that he should be setting a good example, and he hadn't done so. At this point, Roger Martin got increasingly irate. Various letters went backwards and forwards, and the rector, William Gilpin, got drawn into it. He then intervened on the part of his curate, defending his curate's actions, and he told Sir Roger Martin that he should set a good moral example to the rest of the parish, that his status in society meant he had to be better than the rest of them, that he had to be unquestionable. Roger Martin did not agree, and he wanted this apology. He sent his nephew to demand it, and then this declaration was made. I therefore post him as a coward, where he challenged him to a duel. And then what he also did, because Henry Bligh refused to do so and was supported by the rector of the parish in that refusal, Roger Martin then had all the letters, he obviously kept copies of his own, copied up into these broadsheets and presumably distributed around the parish, because he addressed them to the parishioners so that they would know what went on. Now, I have a slight confession to make here, which is that I don't know if they did fight a duel. I don't believe they did, because I've never found any reports of it. But given that duels were illegal and you could be convicted if you survived being injured in one, it would be hard, it can be quite hard to prove whether or not that this occurred. But it is a very interesting question about why he felt such an affront when he was acting in a way that was seen as immoral in many ways. Although many men had mistresses, many men had illegitimate children, and behaved in immoral ways, it was considered that they should, at least in public, set a good example. And what he'd done was that Mary Ann Clark was his housekeeper and his companion, and almost certainly his lover. I don't think there's really any dispute over that. So he was taking her into the church and putting her in the family pew. And the vicar's point was that this should be a place only occupied by the wife. And in Roger Martin's defense, one of the things that he argued was that he'd been subject to much disapproval, that even some of his female relatives had refused to visit him anymore, have any contact with him, and that he felt that Mrs. Clark, as she was given the honorific Mrs., although she wasn't a married woman, was just as good as any other gentlewoman in the village, and that she was a respectable person. So there's a picture here, just in case you're interested, from a family archive of somebody who, a descendant of somebody who knew the family very well. And that's her drawing made in the 1830s of the church, Burnham Westgate Church, just in case you wanted to know what that was. So the questions, of course, were why and how it all began. Now, just at the top is a postcard from around 1911 of Burnham Westgate, the main part of the village. It hasn't changed hugely over the last couple of hundred years. Obviously, there's some new houses gone up, some have disappeared. But if you look very closely, you can see, sorry, my mouse is trying to escape. At the back there is the church, and just over here is where the Reverend Gilpin was living. Just on this side in the corner is the pub, and just behind that, and you can't see it because of the trees, is the hall. And here it is on the tithe map, drawn up a year later, the following year, so that you can see the different locations. Henry Etheridge Bligh lived just over, it's not on this map, it's just out of sight on the edge of the village. So he was a local man. The main characters involved were, as I said, Sir Roger Martin, who came from a family who were granted a baronetcy back in the mid-1600s. His housekeeper and companion, Mary Ann Clark, the curate, Henry Etheridge Bligh. And one of the things that comes out of this was this thing about divisions between social class, and why and how this would be such a controversial thing to do. Why would Roger Martin be expected to set a good example? And perhaps even more so, why would he challenge the kind of social mores of the time by acting in this way? Now, if you read the broadsheets in full, which I've actually transcribed and included in the book I wrote about this event, it's quite evident there's a certain amount of social snobbery going on, a certain amount of deference to Sir Roger Martin, and an expectation that he was at the top end of society and should therefore behave in an appropriate manner. Now, the curate was not from the same social class. He was not a sir, or he was not titled, but he certainly wasn't from the lower end of society either. His father owned a manor, was a lord of a manor. He came from quite a prosperous clergy background for several generations, and was owned and ran a prosperous farm nearby. So they did mix in many of the same circles. They appeared up until and before this event, that you can find newspaper reports of them attending church events and charitable events, putting on meals for the poor of the parish, celebrating big news, the 1832 Reform Act and so on. So they did mix in many of the same circles. Another character in there that I'll come back to is Roger's nephew, Bulkley William Glass, often just known as Bulkley. And of course, the rector, who I've already mentioned, William Gilpin, who lived in the home where Roger Martin had grown up. It's actually this one here. And interestingly, also where Roger's sister had previously lived with her husband, who had been the previous rector of the parish. Roger's sister, Anna Maria, had married their cousin, Reverend John Glass, who was appointed to the parish in 1804. And the roots of this event go back into the 1820s and possibly before, and are really focused around Reverend John Glass and his and Roger's sister, Anna Maria. And that's where this event's origins, where it originated with this couple and their relationships and events, other events going on in their lives. We also, if you know Norfolk and know anything about any of the Burnhams, you'll know that Admiral Horatio Nelson was born at Burnham Thorpe, which is a nearby parish, adjoining parish. The Nelson family were close friends with the Martins. Horatio's father was a good friend of Roger's father, and they were fairly close in age as well. I mean, Horatio Nelson was a little bit older than Roger, but he was quite close in age to one of Roger's sisters, and they mixed socially. They knew each other very well. And Horatio's illegitimate daughter has a bit part to play in this as well. And then we have Elizabeth Helsham, who drew the picture I showed you on the previous slide, whose married name was Jones. Now, she wrote, it's often described as a diary by her descendant, but in fact, it's a memoir. And she wrote her memoir of growing up and featured some of the events and the characters that this is all based around. And it was some of that material is what gave me some great breakthroughs in discovering more about it. And then we have Ellen Clark, who was on the surface Mary Ann Clark's adopted daughter, also referred to as Roger Martin's ward, and one record also referred to as his adopted daughter. So I'll leave that thought with you for a moment, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Just need to take a drink of water. So just to give you a little bit of backdrop, what I was very interested about is that apart from these broadsheets, which I came across in Norfolk Record Office, I found no other reference to this event or to the Lord of the Manor challenging his curate to a duel. But what I did find, and I'm going to come back to that again in a moment, was a reference to another scandal, or rather found a reference to his relationship with Mary Ann Clark in an account in the biography of Horatio Nelson. Horatio Nelson was the illegitimate daughter of Sir Roger of Horatio Nelson, famous admiral, of course. And like many illegitimate children of the gentry and so on, he also referred to her as his adopted daughter, although there's no doubt she was his biological daughter by his mistress. So she comes into it, and the only account of anything that gives a clue as to why Roger might have behaved as he did in 1836 occurs in a biography of Horatio Nelson. And I think there's no source given for this story. So I can only assume that it was passed down as a story through the Nelson, Horatio's descendants. So going back into the 1770s, we have the birth of Roger's sister, Anna Maria. Their cousin, John Glass, was born 2 years later. And Roger Martin was born in 1778. And like many people from a very privileged background, they had governesses, they had private education. He went off to boarding school at one time. But one of the interesting things about the family is that his father, Sir Mordaunt Martin, was a renowned agriculturalist. He introduced into Norfolk a crop known as sainfoin, which helps to fertilize the ground, and obviously had close connections with the Cook family and other renowned agriculturalists, which Norfolk is quite famous for 2 or 3 or more. And yet, despite having a baronetcy, being known as a soldier baron, he did seem to have quite a few financial problems. And I pursued a huge number of letters relating to the Martin family, where he corresponds with the previous lady of the manor, who was a close family friend, who'd been one of his wife's childhood, Sir Martin's wife's friends from childhood. She was called Everilda, and she seems to have bailed them out financially quite a few times. And she had married into the Pitt family, the famous family of politicians, and was extremely wealthy. She also, it also reveals how patronage worked, how knowing the right people and having the right connections could help you in life. Because their friend Lady Camelford, who was known as Anne Pitt from after she married, helped arrange and introduce people to help get another of Roger's sisters a living for her husband to be. She wanted to marry someone who was described as an impoverished clergyman. And through these various connections, they helped to find him a good living by her asking a friend to ask another friend to put a word in for him. Roger Martin's education was partly paid for by this family friend and also by the Spencer family, who are quite well known, of course, and were related in some way to the Martins. And just as an interesting little aside, the girls had a governess called Jane Arden, who I discovered was a close friend of Mary Wollstonecraft, who, of course, wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women and one of the earliest feminist tracts. So it's very appropriate to mention that today on International Women's Day. And Jane Arden is supposed to have influenced Mary Wollstonecraft in many ways. We've no idea how much influence she had on her wards, the young Martin girls, but we do know that after she married and set up her own boarding school for girls, that she remained in close contact with their mother and visited them on occasion. So whether or not she had any influence on Roger, we don't know. Roger seems to have got into a bit of trouble at school. He was very profligate with money, didn't like to settle or study very well. So again, the family connections came into play, and he through those connections, he was obtained a job with the East India Company Civil Service. And then in 1795, he went off to India, where he remained for around 30 years and didn't come back to England until much later on. And it's an interest. I'll come back to that civil service and his time in India in a moment. There's some because there's some very interesting attitudes represented in accounts about him and other people that spent a long time in India, about their morality and seen as perhaps behaving in ways that weren't quite fitting of an English gentleman, that they had been perhaps corrupted by their time in the colonies. And this was certainly something that was said about Roger Martin.